Hi and welcome to this video where we will go a bit deeper into framing in relation to learning. Quick fresh up. Framing is the parts that take place around the gameplay. It is there to shape and enhance the experience, and it includes what happens before, during breaks and after the game. We have already covered emotional processing as part of this course in our material, and now we will focus on the intellectual and the educational processing. I want to start out by highlighting that it's not either or, emotional or intellectual educational. It's both. You need to handle emotions before moving on to this part. And all processing can be done in many different ways, both in direct connection to the game, but also over time. And it can be done unstructured or structured. Many times this is done by having a structured debrief directly after the game. I usually also start out by, together with the participants, establishing what happened during the game and what story just unfolded. This is a chance for everybody to get to hear about things that happened that they personally might not have been part of or missed out on, and to get a common idea about the main story. After that, I go into the emotional debrief and then the intellectual and educational debrief. But this can depend a bit on the game and the group. Intellectual processing. So this is activities focused on the intellectualization of the game and its relevance to other domains of knowledge and or experience. So here we find things like creating new theory or applying existing theories to the play experiences, documenting the events of play, reframing the play to connect it to real world events, etc. And then we have educational processing. Educational processing can be split into three parts. First, we have connection. That is reflecting on the experience in relation to specific learning objectives. Then we have abstraction, relating takeaways from the game experience to concepts or experiences in the wider outside world. And finally, we have contextualization, learning additional information about the context surrounding the topic or granular facts related to it as a means to enhance the learning. And contextualization in this case may also mean assigning additional reading or viewing materials. When designing an educational debrief, I usually think through how and if I have covered these parts. So to give you an example, let's say we have a game about a medieval trial. After the game, we can work with connection by reflecting on how decisions were taken during the game, what groups that had something to say about the verdict, and what fairness meant in the game. And we can then work with abstraction by talking about what we know about the legal systems that were used in real life at this time, if it was fair and for whom, and how legal systems work in our time. We can then contextualize the knowledge by talking about why certain groups had more to say, what society looked like, and what this meant for the different groups. But now I talked about how relating things from the game to the real world can happen in both the intellectual and the educational processing. So what is the difference then? Educational processing is related to learning goals. You can have intellectual processing happening after any type of game. It can be structured in a debrief, but also something that comes from the player. Maybe you played a game that made you think about how monetary system in games can work, and then you write a blog post discussing that after. That would be intellectual processing. For the educational one, it is connected to specific learning goals that are set before. This means an educational game can have both intellectual and educational processing. Now let's talk about some general things about framing and learning that I picked up during my years in the field. So the first thing is expectations. The framing is a place where you can handle expectations. I have found myself coming out to a class to run an edu-larp, and when we showed up, it turned out that the teachers didn't know what a LARP was, and they had told the students that they would watch a theater play. That meant the students was not at all in a mind space of participating. They thought they would just sit and passively watch. They had a totally different expectation. So this meant we had to start out by dealing with that. I mean, for us, it had actually been better if the teachers had asked us before to be able to describe it, or actually said that they didn't know, because then the students at least wouldn't come in set on doing something totally different. But because we had a framing, we could handle it and make it work. The next thing is that learning is situated. The context matters. We have talked about how this has its pros and cons in the video in the previous course. But that learning is situated also means that if you're running a game for formal education, students might have trouble seeing this as learning or learning for school, especially if you are not in a classic classroom setting. I have had situations where after we ran an edu-larp, did surveys, and we asked the students what they have learned. And when we asked this, they could mention a number of things. But when they got the question if they could use this in their ordinary schoolwork, almost all of them said no. So how can we help bridge that? Well, we can work with framing, both before and after. And this is also why I recommend that you should explicitly share the learning goals, why we are doing this, as part of the framing before we start to play the game. Both to set the expectations, but also to help give a lens to apply during the game about what they should focus on. If I know that we are doing a game about norm criticism, then I can bring that with me into the game. The old saying, you find what you're looking for, is relevant here. We want to help the participants to know what to look for. If the participants are new to this, there is also a risk of cognitive overload, of having to keep a lot of things going at the same time. Getting a focus helps with sorting away some things that might not be as relevant. Can you not design for a cool switch effect then, where the participants after or at the end understand what it's about? Do you have to tell them all the time? Can't they get to experience it themselves instead? Not being clear before can lead to strong aha moments, but a lot of the time that doesn't work for more than a few students, and the others might instead be confused, or even worse, they might feel tricked, and then you can trigger their defense systems. So that in the end, that just blocks the learning. So help aim the participants' focus toward the intended learning before instead. So what can we learn when? Here I am talking specifically about educational role-playing games. I have here tried to break it down into 5 main areas that you can learn. Facts, personal and group development, in relation to the experience, systems thinking, and wider connections transfer. And for when, it can be before, during a break in the game, and this could be between scenes or between play sessions. During runtime, so not part of the framing, and after. And this here is based on my experience working with this for many years, It is not all covering in any way, but I hope you can find it helpful. I have tried to base it on how I've usually seen or heard it done to give a slightly more general overview, but there will always be exceptions where a specific game does something differently. And most games probably don't have all of these parts or all the different whens. You might go through something either after or before, but maybe not both. And also, this is about when learning usually can happen. That doesn't mean it will happen, or that it's exactly the same for every student. But we will now go through these different parts to delve into what they can contain and when the learning happens. So let's start out with facts. In the category facts, we find facts, learning basic facts. So this can happen before, during a break in the game, or after. It's not very likely that you learn a new fact during runtime, since then you are usually busy with playing the game. Then we have understanding the meaning of words and terms. By hearing and using a term, you can get a new or deeper understanding of it. And that can happen at all of these different times. Then we have research, basic. With that, I mean doing additional research on the subject and through that learning basic knowledge. This is something that can happen before by reading up for the game or by learning more on a specific subject. Then we have personal and group development. So here we find develop an interest for the subject. And this is really individual and hard to steer, but it can happen at any time. Practicing taking up space usually happens during runtime with the alibi of being in character, not so much out of character. Cooperation and co-creation. This can happen during workshops before by helping to create the world or doing exercises where you have to cooperate. It will also happen during runtime since role-playing games are co-creational in their basic form. It is not as common during a break in the game or after. It could happen after if you, for example, gave them a group task to work with, but this is not done a lot of the time, is my experience. Then we have empathy, acceptance. And this can happen during runtime by feeling empathy for your or someone else's character, but also during a break or after when talking about why the different characters and groups reacted the way they did. Then we have agency, and that is something that can be practiced and learned before by being able to co-create and affect the world, but more strongly during runtime when taking decisions in character. Trying out a new role in the group or a new role for yourself is something that happens during runtime, since that is when you are in character. Then we have learning in relation to the experience. So first we have connection, and this is what we talked about before, reflecting on the experience in relation to specific learning objectives. This rarely happens during runtime, since then you are too immersed in playing the game, but it can happen before, during a break, or after. Understanding and remembering an overarching story is something that we can practice during all of these times. And since stories seems to help us create meaning and understand the causation between information and context, this is a good thing to practice. Construction of different perspectives. This can happen before, during a break, or after, but rarely during runtime, since you then are too immersed in the play. Then we have comparing perspectives based on groups. And this is a bit more complex than constructing perspectives. It can happen during a break, talking about the different groups, how they view things or how they relate, or it can happen after. It usually doesn't happen before, since it is something that manifests during the game in the interaction between the groups, even if it can be scripted into the game. Applied knowledge, and this is about applying knowledge you have since before. So maybe you have learned to do basic algebra in class, but now you need to use it to solve a crypto to get secret information. And this happens during runtime. Embodied knowledge. This is the knowledge you get to physically experience in your body. It's about the emotions that are brought up and handling them. It is one thing to see a movie about standing up to oppression, and it's something totally different to actually try to do it yourself with all the emotions and pressure that comes with it. Then we have system thinking. And here we have cause and effect, and this is on an individual level. So you can see that if you do something, it will have consequences for you and others. By not standing up for what you thought was right, another person got into a bad situation. Or because you told this rumor that then spread, the king got dethroned. The actions happen during runtime, and sometimes seeing the effect is instant, but sometimes it happens during a break or after, when you actually hear someone else tell about how they got affected by what you did. Then we have course of events overarching. It's more about the general story, to see how things fit together, and it doesn't need to connect back to your individual actions. Because this group didn't have the information about what had happened, they took a decision that affected the other group that then thought it was personal and wanted revenge, and so on. And since this is also dependent on the actions during runtime, it won't happen before. Then we have wider connections, transfer. And here we will find things that require more abstract thinking, which is sometimes talked about as higher level knowledge. In fact, we have research basic, and here we have research complex. So this is about, on your own, researching and learning additional information about the topic and the context surrounding the topic. This is more complex additional information hunting, and that usually happens after. In relation to the experience, we had construction of different perspectives and comparing perspectives based on groups. And here we instead have comparing perspectives of contexts. So this could be in a historical game, comparing not just the nobles with the peasants, but instead comparing conditions for people in the Middle Ages compared to people now. And this is something that usually happens after the game, but it could also happen during a break. And the same goes for the next step, to draw conclusions based on the comparisons. And this is even more complex to do. Here we will also find generalization. That is to be able to take out and make generalizations that can be applied in other settings as well. And this usually happens after. And action. This is only relevant in certain types of role-playing games. And this is about not only being able to theoretically think about what you have learned, but about actually acting on that knowledge. So maybe learning about pollution in an edu-larp led you to join Greenpeace. Or learning about democracy made you go vote. This type of actions happens after. Okay, now we have gone through it all. So let's take a look at how this is actually distributed. So, as we can see, we actually have most on after. Here we have 17. And this matches with what we see in other types of research. So let's dig in a bit deeper into the visualization we have here. Here are the same numbers, I've just broken them down a bit more into the specific different areas. So what stands out? Well, we have two of the areas that are very unevenly distributed. The first is personal and group development, the dark purple one. That seems to mainly happen during runtime. And the other one is wider connections, the pink one. That is mainly happening after. But many of these things, as you saw, can happen more than one time. It could happen before and after, for example. So what might be more interesting is things that is mentioned in only one place. And if we instead look at that, what we get then is this. Here we see that it's after and runtime that contains things that can't happen anywhere else. If we start with after, we find things in wider connections and transfer, the pink one. Those were the things that connected to higher level thinking and deeper learning. This is something that can be hard, but also things that we usually want to teach. We don't want our students to only be able to know a lot of facts by heart. We want them to be able to process and use them. And without an after, then you lose the deeper learning. Here it is also important to have a structured debrief, because what has been shown in digital games is that the players tend to learn the system, but without a structured debrief, a lot of the deeper learning actually tends to get lost. So to have deeper learning, we need an after and we need facilitation. What we find under runtime is really interesting, since that actually answers the questions that I know have been asked by teachers. Why should I run the game at all? If it's talking about it that is important, then can't we just have a discussion group? Or maybe watch a movie and then talk about it? Something that is a bit more time efficient and less hard to do for me as a teacher? Well, maybe sometimes you should. It depends on what we want to teach and work with. Let's look closer at what you would miss out on. So here we have things that goes into personal and group development and in relation to the experience. In personal and group development, the two things that are marked only during runtime are taking up space and trying on a new role. That is something that you wouldn't get with watching a movie, for example. And in relation to the experience, the two things that are marked only during runtime are applied knowledge and embodied knowledge. I hope this walkthrough helped you with thinking about what role-playing games can be used for in relation to learning and when that learning happens. And most, if not all, of the things we have gone through, you can also find in other methods. Like we talked about, watching a movie or running a simulation or loads of other things. But this specific combination we have here is something I would say you only find in role-playing games. And since we have talked about how important it is with the after, let's go back to the intellectual and educational processing and the debrief part for a little while. A great tool to help our participants reflect on the experience is to give them prompts to finish, to help them formulate their thoughts. I have made a list that I find helpful to use in these situations. So here are some prompts that you can use in a part of a debrief. I didn't understand blank. I noticed blank. I wonder if blank. I got reminded about blank. I think that blank. I got surprised that blank. I would like to know blank. I would like to understand blank. We have now talked about the importance of having a proper formal debrief in connection to the LARP. And as you will read about in the materials in this course, doing a one-off won't have as much integration as if you keep working with the material over time. But how do you do that if you are not yourself the ordinary teacher of the group? One way is to do it through the community if that is possible, and then keep a discussion going there with your players. Another thing that we used to do when I worked with this out in the field was to create materials for the teachers on how they could integrate this into their ordinary teaching. And this included both general things like making connections back at later stages, but also specific examples of workshops, scenes, writing assignments and such that they could use when we had left. Sometimes we also included recommendations for further readings on the subject and also movies and games that are relevant to the subject. And then, of course, we also tied all of this to the curriculum. This is not a guarantee that the teachers will use it, but it makes it easier for them if they are not experienced in working with these kinds of tools before. To finish off here, I would like to touch upon time. What should you put your time on? The framing? The game? What part of the framing? Well, it depends a bit on the group. How old are they? How well do they know each other? What do they know about role-playing games? And so on. But as an example, when I ran edu-larps as one-offs for schools, then we would, for the 10 to 12-year-olds, often have them for a 6-hour day with 1 hour for lunch. That meant we had 5 hours to work with them. Then we usually did about 2 hours of pre-game activities before lunch. This included explaining what LARP is, getting costumes, doing workshops, and so on. And then we had about 2 hours of play right after lunch. And then we finished off with 1 hour for post-game activities. This was mainly collecting costumes for 5 minutes and then having 55 minutes for debriefing. When we here at the Transformative Play Initiatives have been running shorter scenarios, then we had about 40 minutes for pre-game activities, 20 minutes for play, and 40 minutes for debriefing. So as you can see, the debriefing doesn't actually get that much shorter if you have less time. The first time that goes is actually the playing time. For educational purposes, more time to play is not the important part. It's better to be short and specific and then focus on having more room for debriefing. Thank you for listening. And I will see you in the next video.